In the late spring of 1944, the men of the 1st Marine Division arrived at a place called Pavuvu. They had been promised a rest camp, a chance to recuperate after the hell of Cape Gloucester. Instead, they found a fetid island of mud, rotting coconuts, and armies of land crabs. The stench of decay hung over everything, a thick mat of spoiled fruit that had to be cleared by hand before tents could even be pitched. For these battle hardened veterans and the eager new replacements fresh from the States, the shared misery of Pavuvu became a crucible. It forged a bond between them that no amount of hardship could break, welding the division into a single, unbreakable brotherhood. The food was nearly inedible, the water was foul, and the rats and crabs were relentless. But in the mud and the rain, men learned to depend on each other completely. This was the old breed's final initiation, and every man who endured it emerged stronger for the trial. By the end of August 1944, the division had packed its gear and boarded a fleet of LSTs. They sailed from Pavuvu bound for Guadalcanal, where they would hold final landing rehearsals before their next objective. No one spoke the name of the island yet, but the rumor was it was called Peleliu. On the decks of the ships, Lieutenant Edward A. Jones, known to everyone as Hillbilly, strummed his battered acoustic guitar. The men gathered around him, singing old songs, trying to push away the dread that hung in the air. They knew another battle was coming, and after the misery of Pavuvu, many felt they were ready for anything. But none of them could have imagined what Peleliu truly held in store. On September 4th, the invasion fleet weighed anchor and steamed out of Guadalcanal. The sea was glassy calm under a pale blue sky as the LSTs settled into their formation. Aboard LST 661, Corporal R.V. Bergin lounged near the fantail, watching the distant line of warships on the horizon. The strains of a slow, melancholy tune drifted across the deck from somewhere behind him, and for a few minutes, the war felt very far away. A few yards from the musicians, Private First Class Sterling Mace sat cross-legged on the steel deck, shuffling a worn deck of cards. He was trying to coax a game of battleships out of a friend who seemed more interested in reciting Kipling from memory. Mace listened to the guitar and watched the sun sink into the Pacific, and he felt the familiar knot of dread coiling in his stomach. He knew their destination now, an island called Peleliu, a name that had been whispered for weeks but never spoken aloud until the briefing the night before. Captain Andrew Haldane stood at the rail, staring at the fading light, and he offered no comfort to the men who glanced his way. On the morning of September 12th, the Armada arrived off Peleliu. The island appeared as a low, dark smudge on the horizon, shrouded in heat haze and silence. Then the Navy guns opened up, and the world became a wall of sound. Battleships hurled 14 and 16-inch shells at the island, and carrier planes screamed low over the beaches, dropping napalm and 500-pound bombs. The shoreline vanished behind a curtain of flame and black smoke, and for 2 solid days the bombardment continued without pause. When the guns fell silent, reconnaissance planes flew low over the smoldering island and took hundreds of photographs. The pictures showed that every above-ground structure had been obliterated, but there was no sign of the Japanese heavy artillery that had been clearly visible in earlier photos. The guns had simply vanished into the coral. General William Rupertus had predicted before the invasion that the fight would be rough but fast over in 3 days, but many of the Marines who studied the ridges rising beyond the beach felt a cold certainty that this battle would be unlike any they had ever fought. The first waves of amphibious tractors crawled onto White Beach 1 at 8:32 on the morning of September 15th, barely 2 minutes behind schedule, but the timetable was the only thing going right. Japanese mortar shells and machine gun fire ripped into the closely packed Amtraks as they touched shore, and men fell by the dozens before they could find cover. Captain George Hunt, a former writer for Life magazine who now commanded K Company of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, threw himself into a shell hole as bullets smacked the sand inches from his face. He looked north and saw the problem with terrible clarity. The jagged coral promontory called the Point, a 30-foot-high knob of rock jutting into the ocean, was alive with enemy guns. Colonel Chesty Puller had begged the Navy to target the point during the pre-invasion bombardment, but his request was ignored. Now, every gun the Japanese had hidden in that worm-eaten mass of limestone was firing directly into the exposed left flank of the beachhead. Hunt knew that unless the point was taken, his whole company, maybe the whole battalion, would be bled dry before it could move a yard inland. He committed every man he had left to a brutal frontal assault, and within 15 minutes the Marines had scrambled over the rocks, silenced the enemy machine guns with grenades and rifle fire, and seized the position. But when Hunt counted his remaining men, fewer than 30 were fit for combat, and they were completely cut off from the rest of the regiment. By late afternoon, Hunt and his survivors were surrounded on three sides by Japanese troops who had closed in behind them through the gap in the American line. They had no working radio, barely enough ammunition for another hour of fighting, and almost no water. The only supply route was a shallow stretch of reef that enemy mortars covered with relentless fire. As darkness fell, the Japanese launched the first of several probing attacks, and the Marines on the point answered with everything they had: rifles, grenades, and a captured light machine gun. Hunt made his way along the line, checking each man, knowing that help would not come before morning. 2,000 yards to the south, on the orange beaches, the 5th Marines were pushing inland under a different kind of pressure. Captain Andrew Haldane, commanding K Company of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, got his men off the beach fast and into the scrub at the edge of the airfield. The Japanese fire was scattered but steady, snipers in the brush and mortar rounds falling among the company as it advanced. Haldane needed to link up with the 7th Marines on his right, but no one knew exactly where their line was. He turned to Sergeant Fred Miller, a young squad leader who had already proved himself at Cape Gloucester, and ordered him to work his way south and make contact. Miller ran through the tangled undergrowth, dodging from one patch of cover to the next, until a Japanese machine gun opened up from a pillbox 20 yards ahead. He dived for a shell crater, but he was a split second late. A bullet tore through his left thigh, and another punched through his left hand. The leg wound bled heavily, but Miller forced himself to stay calm, applied a field dressing, shook sulfa powder onto the hole, and gave himself a shot of morphine. For nearly an hour he lay in that crater, firing his M1 at the pillbox every few minutes to keep the enemy gunners from rushing him, until 2 Marines from the 7th spotted him and came to his aid. Stretcher bearers carried Miller to the beach, and within 2 hours he was on a hospital ship, beginning a recovery that would take 17 months. By late afternoon on D-Day, the Japanese artillery from the ridges beyond the airfield never stopped. Shells from the Umurbrogol continued to punish the beachhead through the fading light, and every Marine who could find a few loose rocks or a chunk of coral piled them into a shallow breastwork and waited for night. First light on September 16 revealed the airstrip as a flat, barren killing ground stretching nearly a mile to the far side. Japanese artillery from the Umurbrogol ridges had burrowed into the coral, immune to the 2-day bombardment, and now their shells began to walk across the field. Colonel Bucky Harris gave the order, and the 5th Marines stood up as one, scattering into staggered waves. Platoon Sergeant John Marmot's voice cut through the rising din. "Run like blazes and don't look back." PFC Gene Sledge clenched his carbine, whispered the 23rd Psalm, and broke into a trot, surrounded by hundreds of green-clad figures doing the same. The open coral exploded around them. Machine gun tracers hung at waist height, and mortar rounds kicked up clouds of dust and rock that stung like shrapnel. A machine gun ammo handler named Frank Batchelor felt a sniper's bullet tear into his left arm as he advanced near the runway's edge. A corpsman dressed the wound, and 2 stretcher bearers arrived to carry him back. They had gone barely 40 yards when both bearers were hit in a burst of small arms fire. Batchelor, bleeding, helped the less wounded carrier lift the 3rd man onto the stretcher, and the 3 of them limped to the aid station together. By late afternoon, the surviving Marines had cleared the airfield, but the artillery fire from the Umurbrogol ridges never stopped, punishing every movement across the open coral with relentless bursts. Dusk settled over an exhausted beachhead. Men scooped loose rocks and chunks of coral into shallow rims around their foxholes, knowing that a few inches of piled stone might stop a bullet. The only water that arrived came in 55-gallon drums that had previously held gasoline. When Marines tasted it, many vomited from the petroleum residue. Earlier that day, A few men had discovered a murky sinkhole filled with foul rainwater, and they swarmed it, drinking until their bellies ached. By nightfall, each two-man hole was a shallow depression in the baking coral, and the password for the night was passed from lip to lip down the line. The second night on Peleliu was quieter than the first, but the tension never eased. Men rotated watches, straining to hear the scrape of a boot or the whisper of a Japanese infiltrator. Star shells from Marine mortars lit the sky at intervals, freezing every shadow in white light. No one spoke above a murmur, and every cough or clatter of a dropped canteen drew a dozen loaded rifles. In Corporal Burgeon's foxhole, one man kept his kabar knife stuck in the gravel within reach, while the other stared into the darkness. They did not sleep in shifts so much as in brief, involuntary collapses, always with one hand on a weapon. The ridges to the north remained silent, but the Marines knew the enemy was out there watching, waiting for the next daylight to resume the killing. As darkness fell on September 16th, the surviving Marines on the point knew the Japanese would come again. Captain Hunt counted his able-bodied men. Barely 30 were still fit to fight. Ammunition was low, and the only machine guns left were two captured from dead enemy gunners. Then the mortars opened up and the final assault began. PFC Fred Fox, a Marine with the weapons section of K-31, lay on a narrow ledge near the reef, listening for movement in the shallow water. He heard Japanese voices, stepped down to alert his comrades, and a bayonet slashed across his chest. Fox fired his pistol into the attacker's face, but a grenade blast tore into his side. He crawled, bleeding as another blade stabbed his neck, and then the darkness swallowed him. Fox awoke to seawater rising around his face. The tide was coming in, and he could not move. He called out, and PFC Andy Burns waded into the shallows, lifted Fox in his arms, and carried him back through enemy fire to the Marine line. By dawn, the last Japanese attack on the point had been broken. Hundreds of enemy dead lay piled among the rocks, and the survivors of Company K were finally relieved. 2,000 yards north of the point, Colonel Puller ordered the 2nd Battalion to take Hill 200, a jagged coral height studded with limestone caves and crevices. The Marines advanced up the slope, but from every hole in the ridge, Japanese machine guns and mortars tore into them. Within hours, the battalion was decimated. The caves had swallowed the defenders whole, and no artillery could reach them. On the southern tip of Peleliu, at the promontory called Ngarmokt Island, a different fight was unfolding. PFC Arthur Jackson, a 19-year-old barman from Oregon, watched his platoon get pinned down by a dozen pillboxes. He grabbed his Browning automatic rifle, crawled forward alone, and emptied magazine after magazine into the embrasures. When his ammunition ran low, his squad leader tossed him satchels of grenades and TNT. Jackson destroyed 11 fortified positions in a single hour, killing 50 Japanese soldiers. The last pillbox erupted in a volcano of concrete and steel, and his comrades pounded him on the back as if he had won a football game. For this action, Arthur Jackson would receive the Medal of Honor. But even as he rested, exhausted, the main fight on Bloody Nose Ridge was only growing worse. 2 days later, on September 19th, Captain Everett Pope led Company C on a flanking assault against Hill 100, a rocky knob behind the Five Sisters. His men crossed a swamp under machine gun fire, then charged up the slope. They reached the crest in minutes, only to discover that the hill was not an isolated peak, but the leading edge of a long ridge dominated by higher ground. Japanese guns on 3 sides opened fire. Pope watched Private Philip Collins scoop up enemy grenades and hurl them back, until one exploded in his hand, mangling it badly. But Collins survived and continued fighting, picking up a rifle and firing until he was too weak to reload. By dawn, only 9 of the 25 men who had reached the crest were still alive. Pope ordered a withdrawal. The survivors slid and tumbled down the slope under smoke cover, carrying their wounded. Within hours, the Japanese reoccupied Hill 100, and enemy guns again fired down on the Marines below. The 1st Marine Regiment had lost more than half its men in 8 days. The ridges were still in Japanese hands, and the bloodiest phase of Peleliu was only beginning. By the morning of September 22nd, the 1st Marine Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over half its men were dead or wounded. Colonel Puller's battered survivors were pulled from the line and sent to the beach, their 8-day ordeal finally over. They left behind them a ridgeline still thick with Japanese defenders, and a question that haunted every man who walked off those slopes: who would finish what they had started. 2 days later, on September 23rd, Captain Andrew Haldane climbed a forward slope to scout a new position for K Company. His men watched him go. He had led them through Guadalcanal, through Cape Gloucester, through every yard of Peleliu's hellish beachhead. Minutes later, a Japanese mortar shell landed directly beside him. The blast killed him instantly. There was no time for grief on that ridge. His men carried his body back through the rocks and dust, and word spread through the company in stunned silence. The captain was gone. The company's anchor had been ripped away. For K Company, Haldane's death was a wound that would not close. He had been more than a commander. He had been the steady hand that kept men moving forward when every instinct screamed to stop. Now there was no replacement ready to step into his boots. The company pressed on, but the fight felt different. The loss hung over every foxhole, every cautious advance into the scrub. By September 28th, the 5th Marines turned their attention to Ingizbus Island, a small, heavily fortified spit of ground connected to Peleliu by a shallow causeway. The Japanese had built an auxiliary airstrip there, ringed with bunkers and pillboxes. Navy dive bombers struck the island first, then tanks lumbered across the causeway with infantry close behind. Lieutenant Hillbilly Jones brought his machine gun section forward, and the chatter of .30 caliber fire mixed with the roar of tank cannons. The Marines fought through the fortifications yard by yard, burning the enemy out of their holes with flamethrowers and satchel charges. By nightfall, Ingizbus was secure, but the cost was yet another tally of dead and wounded. The fight on Ingizbus was costly, but the main prize still loomed inland. The Umurbrogol Pocket, a maze of sheer cliffs, narrow ravines, and hundreds of interlocking caves, remained the last stronghold of Colonel Nakagawa's garrison. Day after day, the 5th and 7th Marines pushed into that labyrinth. Men called a deep, narrow cut in the ridge's Death Valley, and they earned that name with every patrol that entered it. Mortar fire rained down from invisible crevices. Snipers fired from holes no one could spot until a gunshot cracked inches away. The advance was measured in yards, not miles, and each yard cost blood. By the first week of October, the division was running on fumes. Men who had landed on D-Day had not slept a full night in weeks. Their dungarees were rotting off their backs. Their eyes were hollow from the 1,000-yard stare that comes from living too long with death. The heat, the thirst, the constant crack of rifles, it all blurred into a single gray ache. The Japanese were cornered but far from beaten. They fought from the last caves with the same ferocity they had shown on day one. On October 10th, the word finally came. The Army's 81st Infantry Division, fresh from the capture of Angaur, moved into the ridges to relieve the 1st Marine Division. The exhausted Marines gathered their gear, walked out of the pocket, and headed for the beach. They did not cheer. There was no brass band. They simply walked, many of them helping a wounded buddy, others limping on their own. Behind them, the crack of rifle fire and the thump of mortars continued as the Army took over the grinding work of clearing the last caves. Ahead lay transport ships, a rest camp back on Pavuvu, and the long, slow task of becoming whole again. But they carried Peleliu with them. More than 6,000 men of the division had been killed or wounded. The island had stripped away the young and the bold, the quiet and the loud, the veterans and the replacements alike. For the survivors, Peleliu would never be a memory, it would be a scar. And in that scar lay the proof of what they had endured together, a brotherhood forged not in glory, but in the shared knowledge of what it cost to walk off that island alive. On October 15, 1944, after 30 days of continuous combat, Peleliu was officially declared secure, but for the men of the 1st Marine Division, the declaration was simply a formality. They had already left the island behind, packed into transport ships and steaming south toward Pavuvu. The survivors did not cheer, they did not celebrate. Most of them simply found a spot on deck, sat down, and stared at the receding shoreline in silence. More than 6,000 of their comrades were not making the voyage with them. Roughly 1,800 were dead, buried in shallow graves on the coral they had bought with their blood. As the transports pushed through the blue water, the men began to talk. Not about the fighting itself, but about the strange, wretched island where they had trained before the invasion. Pavuvu, the place they had hated with such passion, the place of rotting coconuts, land crabs, and knee-deep mud. Now somehow that miserable speck of land had become a beacon. They understood in a way they could not have before that the shared misery of Pavuvu had welded them into something unbreakable. Corporal R.V. Bergen, whose Amtrak had borne the number 13, reflected on the strange luck that had carried him through the entire battle without a scratch. Sterling Mace, the young rifleman from Queens, would carry the memories of lost friends for the rest of his life. Gene Sledge, who had wondered if he would live to see the sunset, watched the island vanish astern and knew he had been changed forever. Sergeant Fred Miller, evacuated on D-Day, spent 17 months in hospitals and eventually recovered. Lieutenant Hillbilly Jones, who had strummed his guitar on the decks, survived the final assault on Ingesbus and shipped home with his instrument intact. Private First Class Fred Fox, dragged from the rising tides, survived his wounds and was evacuated. Arthur Jackson, who had single-handedly destroyed 11 pillboxes, received the Medal of Honor and lived to see the end of the war. Captain Everett Pope, one of the few company commanders to survive Peleliu unscathed, was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his stand on Hill 100. Captain George Hunt, who held the point against impossible odds, survived the battle and returned to civilian life. Captain Andrew Haldane, killed by a mortar shell on September 23rd, was remembered as the heart of K Company. Private Philip Collins survived the grenade blast that mangled his hand and was evacuated. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the Japanese commander, committed suicide after his last stronghold was overrun. The record of Peleliu would eventually fill shelves of military history, but no document could capture what the survivors carried home. They had learned a harsh truth, that a determined enemy, hidden in caves and coral, could turn a quick victory into a grinding ordeal. Yet they had also learned something about themselves. The brotherhood forged in the mud of Pavuvu and tested on the ridges of Peleliu did not dissolve when the shooting stopped. It endured in the quiet reunions of aging men who needed no words to remember what they had shared. If you have a family story from this campaign or another chapter of the Pacific War, we invite you to share it in the comments below. We read each one. And if this documentary has brought that era a little closer, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.